Today, we're diving deep into the 5-second rule by Mel Robbins, a book built around a discovery so simple it almost sounds too small to matter, and yet it has quietly pulled millions of people out of the exact kind of stuck, frozen place Robbins herself was living in when she found it. Here's the problem this book solves. You already know what you should be doing. Get up when the alarm goes off instead of hitting snooze for the 5th time. Raise your hand in the meeting instead of staying quiet. Send the text, make the call, walk into the gym, say the hard thing to the person you love. The knowledge was never the missing piece. The gap has always been between the instinct and the action, that split second where a good idea either turns into movement or quietly dies, buried under a wave of hesitation, doubt, and excuse-making that shows up so fast you don't even notice it happening. Robbins found the rule almost by accident, at one of the lowest points of her life. Her husband's restaurant business was collapsing, their finances were falling apart, and she was lying in bed one more morning, unable to make herself get up, watching the same cycle of paralysis repeat itself day after day. Late one night, she saw a television commercial for a rocket launch, the countdown ticking down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and something in her clicked. The next morning, when the alarm went off and her body did what it always did, freeze, she counted backward exactly like that rocket, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and on one. She physically launched herself out of bed before her brain had time to talk her out of it. It worked. Not because the counting itself was magic, but because it interrupted the hesitation just long enough for her to act before her own mind could stop her. She admits, with the kind of honesty that makes this book feel less like a lecture and more like a conversation with a friend who's actually been through it, that she was skeptical of her own discovery at first. She had built a career giving advice, and here she was, in her 40s, hiding under the covers, unable to summon the discipline she'd once taken for granted. But the small win of that single morning repeated itself the next day, and the next, and within weeks she noticed something larger shifting, not just her mornings, but her willingness to speak up at work, to make an uncomfortable phone call, to walk toward a hard conversation instead of quietly avoiding it the way she always had before. She started testing the countdown deliberately, in every corner of her life, curious whether it was a fluke or something real. She began sharing the technique quietly at first, with friends, then in a talk she almost didn't give, standing backstage moments before walking out, feeling the exact same paralysis she'd felt in bed months earlier, and using the countdown to walk onto that stage anyway. That talk went on to become one of the most viewed of its kind, and the response to it made clear she had stumbled onto something bigger than a personal fix for her own mornings. People from every walk of life, athletes, executives, parents, students, started writing to her describing the same pattern in their own lives. A 5-second gap where their best intentions kept quietly dying, and a simple countdown that, against all reasonable expectation, kept closing that gap for them too. That single, almost silly-sounding discovery became a tool she started using for everything, and it eventually became this book. The core idea is that the moment you feel an instinct to do something that matters, to act on a goal, honor a commitment, or push through fear, you have a 5-second window. If you don't move within that window, your brain will begin generating reasons not to, and the instinct dies. Robbins built an entire method to help you win that 5-second window on purpose, every single time. Over the next half hour, we're going to walk through exactly how this rule works on a psychological level, and how it applies to everything from confidence and procrastination to anxiety, grief, and the hardest conversations you've been avoiding. Before we get into it, if you're someone who genuinely loves books like this, ideas that don't just entertain you but actually change how you move through hesitation and fear, it would mean a lot if you hit subscribe, tap that like button, and turned on notifications. This channel exists for people who want to think more clearly and live more intentionally, and there's a lot more of that coming. Alright, let's get into it. The physiology of hesitation, and why counting works. Let's start with what's actually happening inside you in that 5-second window. Because Robbins didn't just stumble onto a cute trick, she stumbled onto something with real psychological weight behind it. She calls it the physiology of hesitation. The instant you feel an instinct to do something slightly uncomfortable, get out of bed early, speak up in a meeting, approach a stranger, send a difficult message, your brain, in an attempt to protect you from discomfort, starts generating hesitation almost immediately. That hesitation isn't a character flaw. It's your mind doing exactly what it evolved to do, treating any form of risk or discomfort as something to be avoided. The same reflex that once kept your ancestors away from genuine physical danger, now firing off in response to something as harmless as raising your hand in a conference room. The trouble is, that hesitation signal moves fast, and once it takes hold, it snowballs. A flicker of doubt turns into a small excuse, which turns into a fully formed justification for why now isn't the right time. And within seconds, the instinct that would have moved you forward is gone, replaced by a story that feels completely reasonable in the moment and completely hollow in hindsight. Robbins argues that this process happens so quickly and so automatically that most of us never even notice we're doing it. We just experience the outcome, another day where we didn't make the call, didn't go to the gym, didn't say the thing we needed to say, and we quietly chalk it up to not having enough discipline or willpower, when the real culprit was a 5-second window we lost before we even knew we were in it. Part of what makes this so hard to catch in real time is that hesitation rarely announces itself honestly. It doesn't show up as fear or avoidance. It shows up dressed as a perfectly sensible reason. I'll call after lunch. I'm too tired tonight. It's probably not the best time anyway. None of these thoughts feel like excuses in the moment they arrive. They feel like reasonable conclusions, arrived at through what seems like careful consideration. That's exactly what makes the window so easy to lose without ever realizing you were standing in one. This is exactly where the countdown comes in, and its power lies in something Robbins ties directly to neuroscience, specifically to the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for deliberate, willful action, and for shifting your attention away from automatic, habitual responses. Counting backward, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, is a form of what researchers call metacognition, essentially, thinking about your own thinking in real time. The physical act of counting requires just enough conscious attention that it interrupts the automatic spiral of hesitation before it can fully take hold. It's not that the numbers themselves hold any power. It's that counting activates your prefrontal cortex and pulls your focus away from the worry loop your brain was about to run, giving you just enough of a gap to physically move your body before doubt has time to finish its sentence. Robbins is blunt about a companion idea that trips a lot of people up: the belief that you need to feel ready, motivated, or confident before you act. She argues the opposite is closer to the truth. Feelings, in this context, are largely irrelevant. You will almost never feel like getting out of bed early, making the uncomfortable phone call, or walking into a room full of strangers. Waiting to feel ready is often just another form of hesitation wearing a more respectable disguise. The 5-second rule works precisely because it removes feeling from the equation entirely. You count, and on 1, you move, regardless of whether your emotions have caught up yet. Action, she argues, creates motivation far more reliably than motivation ever creates action. You don't wait to feel brave before you act bravely. You act, and the courage catches up to you a few seconds later, almost every time. Robbins ties this to a concept she borrows loosely from physics: activation energy, the small burst of energy required to start a chemical reaction before it can sustain itself. Most goals, she argues, don't actually require enormous, sustained effort to succeed. They require one disproportionately difficult moment of ignition: the getting up, the walking in, the hitting send, after which the task itself is often far easier than the anticipation of it ever was. Our brains, however, tend to badly overestimate how hard that entire task will be. using the discomfort of the very first second as a stand-in for the discomfort of the whole thing. The 5-second rule exists specifically to get you past that inflated first moment, the ignition point, quickly enough that your brain doesn't have time to finish exaggerating the difficulty of everything that comes after it. Courage, confidence, and the end of procrastination. Now let's look at where this rule shows up most visibly, in the moments that require raw courage. Robbins tells the story of a shy engineer who used the countdown to force herself to speak up in meetings where she normally stayed silent. Counting down under her breath the instant she felt the urge to contribute, and physically raising her hand on one, before the familiar wave of self-doubt could talk her back into silence. Over time, that repeated 5-second push built something her natural personality never would have handed her on its own. A visible reputation as someone who contributes, who's engaged, who has ideas worth hearing. Robbins is careful to point out that this wasn't a personality transplant. The engineer didn't become a naturally outgoing person overnight. She simply got better and better at winning that one small window, over and over, until the accumulated evidence of her own actions started to change how she saw herself. This connects to something Robbins calls the courage cycle. Confidence, in her framing, isn't a personality trait you either have or don't have. It's a byproduct of action. Every time you use the 5-second window to push through hesitation and act anyway, you hand yourself a small piece of proof that you're capable of doing hard things. That proof accumulates. Confidence isn't the starting point that makes brave action possible. It's the result you get after you've acted bravely enough times that the evidence becomes undeniable. This flips the usual advice on its head. Most of us wait to feel confident before trying something intimidating. Robbins argues you have it backward. The confidence shows up after the action, as a direct consequence of it, almost never before. She's careful to distinguish this from blind recklessness. The rule isn't a call to abandon judgment or leap into genuinely dangerous situations without thinking. It's specifically aimed at the far more common category of moments where the only real risk is discomfort, embarrassment, or the small vulnerability of being seen trying. Those are the moments where hesitation does the most damage over a lifetime, not because any single one of them was catastrophic, but because their sheer volume, added up across years, quietly determines how big or how small a life ends up being. Procrastination gets the same treatment, and Robbins reframes it in a way that removes a lot of the shame usually attached to it. Procrastination isn't laziness. It's a form of hesitation that's been allowed to compound over days, weeks, or months instead of just 5 seconds. The unwritten email, the unmade appointment, the project you keep pushing to tomorrow, each one started as a tiny, forgettable moment of hesitation that nobody caught and interrupted in time. The task didn't get harder while you avoided it. Your relationship to starting it did, because every day you don't begin adds a little more emotional weight to the decision, making the next attempt to start feel even more daunting than the last. The fix, predictably, is the same 5-second push, applied the instant you notice yourself avoiding something. Robbins suggests using the countdown specifically at the moment you catch that familiar internal flinch away from a task. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then doing something, anything, physically connected to starting, opening the document, dialing the number, putting on your shoes. She's careful to note that the goal isn't to finish the entire task in 5 seconds. It's to break the seal on starting, because starting is almost always the hardest part, and momentum, once it exists, tends to carry you much further than willpower ever could on its own. Robbins shares an example from a salesperson who used the rule to get through the single most dreaded part of the job, picking up the phone to make a cold call. Every salesperson knows the feeling, the phone sitting there, the number already dialed halfway through in your head, and the sudden urge to check email first, refill your coffee, find literally anything else to do before that call. He started counting down the moment that urge appeared, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and dialing on 1, without giving himself a single second to negotiate. Over months, the number of calls he actually made climbed dramatically, not because cold calling became less uncomfortable, but because he stopped giving himself the 5 seconds of runway his hesitation needed to talk him out of it. The discomfort of the task never changed. His willingness to walk directly into it, before doubt had time to build a case against it, did. Quieting anxiety, building healthy habits, and showing up in relationships. Robbins takes the rule somewhere a lot of readers didn't expect, into the middle of anxious, spiraling thoughts. She describes worry as a habit with its own 5-second window, a single anxious thought that, left uninterrupted, snowballs into a full catastrophic scenario within moments. One worry about being late leads to imagining the meeting going badly, which leads to imagining losing the job, which leads to imagining financial ruin, all within the space of a few seconds, all without a single piece of new information actually arriving. She suggests using the countdown the instant you notice a worry spiral beginning, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, followed immediately by a small physical action, standing up, changing rooms, starting a task you can actually control. The counting doesn't erase the anxious feeling. Robbins is emphatic that this window is genuinely brief, not a loose metaphor but something closer to a literal, measurable few seconds. Wait past it, and your mind has already begun assembling a rationale, one that will feel entirely convincing by the time you examine it. That's part of what makes hesitation so difficult to catch in the moment. It doesn't announce itself as fear or avoidance. It shows up dressed as a perfectly sensible reason. I'll do it after lunch. I'm too tired right now. It's probably not the right time anyway. None of these thoughts feel like excuses while you're having them. They feel like reasonable conclusions. The 5-second rule works because it asks you to act before that internal committee has finished its meeting, not because the meeting's conclusions are always wrong, but because, far more often than we'd like to admit, they exist purely to protect us from a discomfort that was never actually dangerous in the first place. In the case of a worry spiral specifically, that same countdown interrupts the automatic momentum before it builds, giving you enough of a gap to redirect your attention towards something within your control, which is often enough to keep a fleeting worry from calcifying into a spiraling anxiety attack. The same mechanic shows up in how Robbins talks about building healthier habits, and here she leans on a particularly useful reframe. Most people wait for motivation to go to the gym, eat well, or start a new routine, and motivation, being an emotion, is notoriously unreliable, here one day and completely absent the next. Robbins argues you should stop waiting for it entirely. The instant you feel the smallest flicker of intention, I should go for a walk, I should skip the second drink, I should go to bed instead of scrolling, count it down and act before the flicker fades. She points out that most healthy choices aren't lost to a dramatic moment of willpower failure. They're lost in a quiet, forgettable few seconds where the easier, less effortful option quietly won by default, simply because nothing interrupted the drift toward it. She points to a reader who described using the countdown specifically before public speaking, an activity that reliably ranks among people's most dreaded experiences, right alongside genuinely dangerous situations, at least according to how the brain reacts to it. Standing in the wings before walking on stage, that reader would feel the same paralyzing urge to bolt that Robbins had felt lying in bed years earlier. The countdown didn't remove the fear. It simply got her walking before the fear could finish building its case for staying backstage. She reported, afterward, that the fear reliably faded within the first minute of actually speaking, exactly the pattern Robbins describes throughout the book, that the anticipation is almost always worse than the actual doing. Relationships get some of the most tender treatment in the entire book, because Robbins argues that some of our biggest regrets aren't things we did. They're the words we almost said and didn't. The apology we meant to offer and let get swallowed by pride. The I love you we felt but didn't say out loud because the moment felt slightly too vulnerable. The check-in text to an old friend we kept meaning to send. She encourages using the countdown specifically in these tender, high-stakes moments, precisely because the emotional risk involved is exactly what triggers hesitation the fastest and the hardest. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then say it, send it, reach out, before the more comfortable, safer instinct to stay quiet has time to win. Robbins argues that very few people regret the vulnerable thing they said in a moment of courage. Almost everyone carries a quiet ache over the one they didn't. Robbins is especially candid about how this played out in her own attempts to exercise consistently, something she'd failed at repeatedly for years despite genuinely wanting the habit to stick. She noticed the failure point was never actually the workout itself. It was the sliver of time between deciding to go and actually putting her shoes on. The exact window where a dozen small, reasonable-sounding excuses always managed to slip in first. Once she started applying the countdown specifically to that narrow window, lacing up her shoes on the count of one before she could talk herself into a rest day she didn't actually need, her consistency changed almost overnight. The workouts themselves hadn't gotten any easier. She had simply stopped giving her hesitation the opening it needed to win. Grief, cravings, and becoming someone who acts. Robbins doesn't shy away from applying this rule to some of the heaviest experiences we go through, including grief. She writes about using the countdown not to suppress grief or rush through it, but to interrupt the specific moments where sorrow threatens to keep you frozen entirely, unable to get out of bed, unable to return a call, unable to take the next small step that life still requires of you even in the middle of loss. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then just the next tiny motion. Feet on the floor, one phone call answered, one meal eaten. She's clear that this isn't about rushing the grieving process or pretending the pain away. It's about making sure grief doesn't also steal your ability to function, one 5-second window at a time, until the weight becomes something you can carry while still moving forward, rather than something that stops you entirely. The rule also becomes a tool for interrupting cravings and compulsive habits, whether that's reaching for a cigarette, opening a food delivery app out of boredom, or picking up the phone to check social media for the 100th time in a day. Robbins explains that cravings, much like hesitation, have their own short window before they take over completely. The urge arrives, and if you act on it immediately, the habit strengthens. But if you can interrupt that opening few seconds with the countdown and a different, deliberate action, going for a short walk, drinking a glass of water, calling a friend, you create a small gap where the craving loses some of its automatic power. Repeated enough times, that gap is where new habits, and the freedom from old ones, actually get built. Underneath every one of these applications sits a bigger transformation Robbins is quietly arguing for, a shift in identity itself. She insists that consistently using the 5-second rule doesn't just change individual moments, it slowly changes how you see yourself. Each time you count down and act despite hesitation, fear, grief, or a craving pulling you the other way, you collect one more small piece of evidence that you're the kind of person who follows through. Do that enough times, across enough different areas of your life, and the identity shift becomes real, not because you decided to believe something new about yourself, but because you built the proof for it, one 5-second window at a time. Robbins shares letters from readers who used the rule in genuinely high-stakes recovery, people managing addiction who described the craving itself as unbearable in the moment but, crucially, short-lived, often passing within a minute or two if they could simply survive the initial surge without acting on it. For them, the countdown became a bridge across that surge. 5 seconds of counting followed immediately by a physical action incompatible with the craving. Leaving the room, calling their sponsor, splashing cold water on their face. None of them described this as easy, but several described it as the first tool that gave them something concrete to do in the exact moment they used to feel most powerless, a specific, repeatable action to reach for instead of just white-knuckling their way through willpower alone. What Robbins seems to value most about the rule, across every one of these applications, is how democratic it is. It doesn't require a particular personality type, a naturally brave disposition, or years of therapy to access. A 5-second countdown is available to absolutely anyone, in absolutely any moment, regardless of how anxious, exhausted, or emotionally depleted they happen to feel right then. That accessibility is precisely why it spread the way it did, from her own bedroom, to a stage, to millions of readers who needed something they could actually use in the middle of an ordinary, difficult Tuesday, not a grand theory to admire from a distance. Robbins also writes about using the rule in parenting, specifically in the split second before reacting to a child's meltdown, a sibling argument, or a moment of frustration that could easily spiral into a raised voice she'd later regret. The same 5-second window that governs courage and procrastination, she found, also governs patience. The instant she felt her own temper rising, she'd count down, not to suppress the feeling, but to create just enough space to choose a calmer response instead of reacting on pure impulse. Parenting, she notes, is full of these small 5-second forks, and the parent she wanted to be and the parent she sometimes became were often separated by nothing more than whether she won that brief window or lost it. So let's bring this all together. If there's one idea from the 5-second rule worth carrying with you long after this video ends, it's this. The life you want isn't blocked by some deep character flaw or a permanent lack of willpower. It's being decided, quietly, in windows of about 5 seconds, dozens of times a day, most of which you've probably never even noticed. Every one of those windows is a small, private fork in the road. Hesitate, and the moment closes, replaced by a perfectly reasonable excuse. Move, and you take one more small step toward becoming someone who follows through. Here's the actionable piece to walk away with today. You don't need a life overhaul. You need one instinct, today, that you actually honor. The next time you feel that familiar flicker, the urge to speak up, to send the message, to get up before the snooze button wins again, count it down out loud if you can. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and move your body before your mind finishes the sentence talking you out of it. That's the whole practice. Not motivation, not confidence, not the perfect moment. Just 5 seconds, and the willingness to act inside them before hesitation gets its say. Robbins likes to remind readers that nobody's life changes because of one enormous, dramatic decision made in a single defining moment. It changes because of thousands of small 5-second decisions, made consistently enough that they quietly rewrite who you become. The version of you that speaks up, shows up, and follows through isn't a different person you need to somehow locate or invent. It's simply the accumulated result of choosing to move, again and again, in the handful of seconds when it would have been easier not to. That version of you is built, 5 seconds at a time, starting whenever you decide to start. There's a particular kind of relief in that framing, because it means you're never actually behind, and you never have to wait for some larger transformation before you're allowed to begin. You don't need Monday, you don't need to feel more confident first, you don't need life to settle down before you start. The very next instinct you feel, however small it seems, is a perfectly valid place to start. Robbins would say that's the entire point of the book. The rule was never meant for the big, dramatic turning points alone. It was built for the ordinary, forgettable moments in between, the ones that, quietly added together, end up becoming your life. Ordinary courage, in other words, isn't reserved for extraordinary people or extraordinary circumstances. It's available to you the next time your alarm goes off, the next time your hand hesitates over send, the next time you feel the urge to say something true and the impulse to swallow it instead. 5 seconds is a small enough unit of time that it stops feeling intimidating, and that, more than anything else in this book, might be its quiet genius. You were never being asked to be fearless. You were only ever being asked to move for 5 seconds, and to trust that the rest of you would catch up. If this video gave you something to sit with, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop a comment below with your favorite thought from today, the idea that hit you hardest, and let's talk about it. And if you want more conversations like this one, thoughtful, unhurried, built around books that actually change how you live, come join us. Subscribe to The Mind Master, and let's keep learning to close that gap between instinct and action, one 5-second window at a time. I'll see you in the next one.